Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's National Teen Book Club broadcast. We're so glad you've been able to join us for our Q&A today, which will last around 45 minutes. We're going to start with a quick introduction to our guest speaker and then move on to our questions and discussion.
Joining us today is Abdi Nazemian. Abdi is the author of the Chandler Legacies Like a Love Story, Stonewall Honor Book, and The Authentics. His novel, The Walk-in Closet, won the Lambda Literary Award for LGBT Debut Fiction. His screenwriting credits include the films The Artist's Wife, The Quiet and Menendez, Blood Brothers, and the television series The Village and Almost Family. He has been an executive producer and associate producer on numerous films, including Call Me By Your Name, Little Woods, and The House of Tomorrow. Abdi's joining us all the way from Los Angeles, where he lives with his husband, their 2 children, and their dog, Disco.
Hello.
Hello, Abdi. So this session is the 5th in 6 author talks. We're so happy to have Abdi today. So that's 6 author talks, which are linked to our hero read for the term, which is Charlotte Bronte's Gothic classic, Jane Eyre, and Patrice Lawrence's abridged retelling of the story. Abdi's career in storytelling is extensive, and we'll be hearing more about his career experience, success, and advice during this session as part of National Teen Book Club and Discover Creative Careers Month. His book, Only This Beautiful Moment, is described by its publisher, Little Tiger, as an ode to the fragile bonds of family, the hidden secrets of history, and all the beautiful moments that make us who we are today. A quote that we think could also apply to Jane Eyre. There are common themes between the 2 books, and we'll explore them more in the Q&A. Abdi's latest book, Desert Echoes, is also on screen and out now.
I'm so obsessed with this graphic of the books.
Abdi, I'm paranoid that I stumbled over your surname there at the beginning, so please correct me if it needs repeating.
Oh, please. Well, to be honest, and this is kind of funny when you're Iranian speaking English, no one in my family agrees on how to pronounce my surname. So I pronounce it Nazemian. I have a cousin who pronounces it Nazemian. My brother and parents, I think, say Nazemian. So there's no, in Persian, we say Nazemian, but I tend not to expect people to say that. So
as Savitri Patel, I recognize where you're coming from with that one. Everybody on this call, you can submit your questions for Abdi via the Q&A Slido function underneath the stream on your screen. You may have to scroll down a bit to see it. You can also submit questions via the QR code on screen or by typing in the code online. The Q&A function will be open throughout the discussion, so you can join in at any time. And if you're experiencing any issues with the stream, please do let us know. Use that area there, and we will try our best to support you.
So hi, Abdi. We're going to launch into our first question about your book. So can you tell us a bit more about Only This Beautiful Moment, please?
Sure. Only This Beautiful Moment is a novel that is told from 3 perspectives. Each perspective is a man in the same Iranian family from a different generation. So grandfather, father, son, and it takes place in the 1930s, the 1970s, and the present day. And in each narrative, the character is narrating as a teenager who is either going to be going from Iran to the United States or the United States to Iran, specifically Los Angeles and Tehran. So it's very much a novel about the relationship between these 2 places, East and West, that have a very intertwined history, but also a novel about, kind of a classic immigrant story where the 3 generations of characters are disconnected from each other because their lives were lived in such different times and places. And so there's little secrets hidden in each place. And 2 of the characters are queer. One is not. That's a big part of it, exploring queer life and queer rights through history and through different lenses of East and West. And it's very much inspired by if not like the specifics of my personal experience, by the emotional part of my personal experience. I was born in Iran. My family left when I was 2, and I really grew up feeling very disconnected from my past and my roots because there was all this trauma that we escaped. And so it's also a novel about the importance of talking through the issues between generations, of not shutting off conversation, even with people who disagree with you, because often the reasons they disagree are because of a lot of personal experiences that you haven't heard yet. So it's very much about these 3 generations of men finally communicating their stories to each other.
That's a great synopsis. Thank you. And there's so much subtlety in the in the nuances of those different experiences and how they have to sort of learn to understand each other's perspectives. You've sort of answered there. I mean, we've touched on previously, but so family and family secrets is a focus of Jane Eyre too, which is part of the reason that we wanted you to come and speak to our book group this series. But you've probably sort of already started to answer this question, which can be a new Elizabethan school were after, which was what inspired or motivated you to write a story like this. So I'm going to link in Frome colleges who've been discussing in their sessions together. Where do you gather your inspiration from more generally?
Well, I mean, I could talk about that for the full hour. You know, I was a kid who really, really leaned on storytelling. I moved to the United States when I was 10, and before then, we moved from Iran to France to Canada in quick succession. And so I was a kid who didn't have consistent friends outside of my cousins and family. And so I really leaned on books, movies, music, kind of the world of fiction and fantasy to make me feel whole. So I think, first of all, that's part of my inspiration, is knowing the power of stories. But then beyond that, when I realized I wanted to be a writer, and I know we'll talk about this more, I started my career in film and TV and still work in film and TV. I very much felt like writing was a business where I was trying to feed what the business wanted. It wasn't until I started writing books that I started to tell very personal stories. And for me, my biggest inspiration is really my life. I tend to begin with questions of like, what part of my own life feels unanswered, unfinished, what's something that I want to talk about. And because of who I am, a lot of my life just hasn't been represented. I mean, the first novel I ever wrote is, from what everyone has told me, and no one's corrected me, the very first novel to have a gay male Iranian lead character. And that was 2014. So these discussions about queer identity within my cultural community did not exist. And so for me, that's a huge inspiration. You know, with this book, one of the biggest inspirations just came from conversations I had here in the United States from people who seem to have zero understanding of the relationship between Iran and the United States and how that affects us as immigrants who live here. Kind of the balancing that I feel that many immigrants have, but I'll speak specifically to myself, of, on the one hand, huge gratitude to the country that takes you in, and on the other hand, resentment because the actions of that country are the reason you had to flee in the first place. And in this book, the middle character of the father, Saeed, has a lot of anger in him toward the US because in the 1950s, the United States deposed a democratic leader in Iran. They're the ones who got rid of democracy in Iran and installed a monarchy. They changed the whole country. You know, they be for oil, because at that point, and you guys are in the UK, so you should know this too, it was the UK and the US who were basically taking all the oil from Iran. And Mossadegh, who was the democratically elected leader, wanted to nationalize the oil and have profits actually go to the Iranian people. And that was obviously not okay with the West, and began this whole chain. It was actually the first coup the CIA from the United States ever did. So, you know, these are things that really inspired me for this book in particular, was just wanting people in the West to have a more nuanced understanding of their own history, especially as it pertains to people who are coexisting with them as immigrants in their countries, not from a place of trying to divide, but from a place of having to have more nuanced, honest conversation so we can all move forward together.
Thank you, Abdi. And I think what you've just spoken about there kind of links to our next question about outsiderness. So both your contemporary story, Only This Beautiful Moment, and classic tale, Jane Eyre, have protagonists who are displaced and feel like outsiders. Do you think themes connected to identity and belonging are timeless themes to explore in storytelling?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I want to acknowledge how absolutely wild it is to be discussing my book in relation to Jane Eyre. I was an English major in college, university, for you guys. So to be talking about my book in relation to a book like Jane Eyre is very surreal. But yeah, of course. And I think part of that goes back to what I just talked about, which is like, I was a kid who didn't feel like I belonged in the community I was being raised in when I moved to the US, you know, and when I moved to France, Canada. I was always an outsider. And as an outsider who didn't feel reflected by the school I was going to, the people I would see on the streets, books and stories were a refuge for me. So I think themes of outsiderness are always going to be timeless because outsiders are people who need stories most. I think, people who feel reflected by the community they live in don't need storytelling in the same way. They don't need that refuge, and stories, I think, very much are a refuge. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, from Jane Eyre to, so many of the great books that when I think back to like the books, Dickens, Great Expectations, whatever it is, it's so many books as their starting point are about an outsider, not only entering a new world, which makes for a great story, but it's about helping the reader to feel seen so that all human beings have places to go. And if you don't have somewhere to go in your own life, you go to a story.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's one of the things we do want to do with these conversations is, look at contemporary resonances in less obvious ways, potentially.
Yes.
So obviously, Jane Eyre is an orphan and your characters are separated from their parents at various points and in various different ways throughout the book. Something else which is associated with feeling like an outsider or being marginalized is a lack of power and sort of voice and agency, which again is something that's common across both books, although both are also ultimately quite hopeful. Does that resonate with why you think storytelling can be important? And I've got a sort of follow-up question, but I'd be interested, is that part of what you think storytelling is important? And is that sense of hope and optimism something that influences your work and career? I'll do the second part when you've had a chance to.
I mean, yes and yes. Like, I think there's two ways to look at storytelling. And like I said, I began in film and TV. There's storytelling as a job. So sometimes I'll take a job writing a movie or a TV show that's not necessarily about belonging or displacement or not being seen. It's about entertaining people and creating a product. And that can be a wonderful thing too. But I think when we're talking about books like Jane Eyre, we're talking about books like mine, books that are written from an author's heart. They're often written because the author feels like some part of themselves is not understood. I know for myself, the reason I write my books is because I feel like most of the things I went through have not been properly represented and understood. I mean, I'm thinking right now about the first book I wrote that I genuinely felt like reflected every piece of myself was a novel called Like a Love Story that deals with the AIDS crisis in New York City. It was very much inspired by me moving at a young age to New York. It was the exact age. It was, I was 10, but it was the age where I started to realize I was gay and what my sexuality was at a time when being gay was synonymous with stigma, death. There was a virus sweeping that city. The president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, didn't even say the word AIDS for 4 years, let alone do anything about it. The level of stigmatization was so huge. And that novel is very much an ode to ACT UP, which was an activist organization that fought back in brilliant ways and that should be studied, to artists like Madonna, who at that point was one of the only people speaking to young people about queer life in a way that wasn't grounded in shame and stigma, but was in education. I mean, that's how I learned about safe sex, was through her. That's how I learned about gay pride, about a lot of things that changed my life. So, when I think about a novel like that and a novel like Only This Beautiful Moment, I write them both to heal that part of myself that felt a little broken by those experiences, but more than anything to share the parts of my own life that I felt like a light hasn't been shined on them by someone else. And so I'm in a unique position to shine a light on something that probably others feel. And I think the most powerful thing for me as an author has been to realize every time I write a book that's about an experience that feels so specific to me, countless readers come and say, I felt the exact same thing. I felt the exact same way. And so we're never alone in our experiences. And that's also the power of fiction. And now that I think about it, actually, Jane Eyre was orphaned. You were talking about those things, but Jane Eyre was orphaned because of typhus, right? And that's something that's really interesting to me too, because so much of Like a Love Story is about a generation lost to AIDS and what that meant for that community. In Only This Beautiful Moment, there's a lot of political strife. There's characters who are having to say goodbye to loved ones because of politics, because they need to flee. I mean, I think this idea that history, both unfortunately and fortunately, repeats itself, unfortunately, because you're always going to have pandemics and wars, and insert other horrible things, but also fortunately in that I think when I write my books, I always try to lean into the hope and the joy and the community and the way that people respond. And that also needs to be validated and studied. When I was writing Like a Love Story, kind of my thesis for it is I want to shine a light on the best of history, not the worst of it, so that we can emulate the best. I often feel like when we talk about history, we talk about don't repeat history. But actually, I think especially right now, when you look at what's going around the world in terms of fascist leaders and wars and a lot of horrible things are happening, and I think young people can and should study organizations like ACT UP to figure out how do we create change, and they should study the history of Western intervention in the Middle East to talk about how do we change this dynamic so we don't just continue the same thing that hasn't been working.
So I think you've sort of instinctively started on what is the second part of that question then, is do you have any tips for our audience who might either just be grappling with dealing with some of these things in their own lives that you've talked about earlier, or actually in their own creative work or their studies?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one because I have two kids too who are almost 13. So they're, I'm not sure what the exact age range is, but they're probably close to the age range you guys are in. And I do really believe there's a lot young people should do. And I also think young people should have the luxury of being young. I want young people to also have fun. And, yes, it's a great time to be passionate and be immersed, but I sometimes feel like this generation of young people just has so much on their shoulders. Um, but yes, I mean, to what I was saying before, studying the best of history, study your heroes. Think of like when you think of who changed the world in ways that you like, study how they did it. What were their plans? How did they get through it? But the other piece I want to say, and this I really think is important, is when I write about some pretty heavy topics. In Like a Love Story, I wrote about AIDS and ACT UP in Only This Beautiful Moment. A lot of that book is really about queer life in Iran, especially in the modern section of that book. I have not returned to Iran since I was 2, but I have cousins who live there. I have friends who live there, and they were very gracious in talking to me. And so I do a lot of firsthand research for my books. I spoke to ACT UP members for Like a Love Story. I spoke to people who live in Iran for Only This Beautiful Moment. And in both cases, they told me the same thing, which is even when life is at its hardest, even when you're losing all your friends to an epidemic, even when you're living under the worst political repression and, can't be yourself, you find ways to congregate within community. ACT UP members would always tell me like we were raging during the day and creating actions to change the world, but we were also going out dancing and having fun and laughing together. And similarly in Iran, a lot of that, my favorite scene of Only This Beautiful Moment is the scene where Mood, the contemporary character, arrives to Iran and his cousin Ava takes him to a secret party the first night, and it's full of queer people and full of artists and full of life. And that's very much inspired by something that happened to a friend of mine who went to Iran, who was taken out by a cousin of mine. And similarly in Iran, they would talk to me about like how even though it's so repressive, they find places to congregate, to be young, to be artists, to be queer. And so all of this I'm saying to say, when you're young, I think one of the most important things you can do is lean into building a real community of support for yourself. So whatever that looks like for you, there will be a lot of work ahead of you, both in terms of academic work, but also the work of creating a life, whatever that means to you. And that might mean being an artist, being an activist, starting a career, being a parent, getting married, all the things that humans do, all of which is very hard if you don't have a solid community of friends, allies. So I really think that would be my biggest piece of advice, is build a real community for yourself of people you trust who are going to give you that strength to fall back on when you need it. And that community could be family, friends, a combination. Insert here.
That's really great advice, Abdi. And I just wonder about your support network via your publishing team. So in your author's note, you say that you are really grateful to have a literary healer as an editor. So how important is it to find the right team to help you progress and produce your stories?
So important. This goes back to this idea of what I was saying about finding the right community that supports you. When I started writing, I mean, my first novel I mentioned was the first novel to have a gay Iranian male lead, but in many ways, and I'm very proud of that novel, but it's not a novel that feels like it's of my soul. I feel like the protagonist of that novel is an outsider, is a white female character looking into the Iranian family. I was still writing from a place of remove. Um, and and then my first YA book, similarly, also I had a female protagonist. I felt like after 10 years in Hollywood, I was constantly told not to write queer characters or Iranian characters. And I internalized so much of that, trying to find more commercial ways to enter my stories. And I had the real privilege of working with an incredible editor over 5 books or 4 books. Like, God, this is what happens when you get old. You lose track of your own life. But before writing Like a Love Story, I kept pitching her ideas for books that I thought were like very commercial, because I was raised in a Hollywood mentality that's like, come up with a fun concept. Like, even if you're writing about your own cultural community, you've got to come up with like a gimmicky concept to sell it. And she kept rejecting my ideas. And finally, we had lunch one day and she said, I want you to write something that's from your heart. What's the story you want to tell? And the idea of Like a Love Story, I don't plot out my books, so I didn't have the whole plot, but the idea of it, the idea of writing about my particular generation of queer people and where we were at in the AIDS crisis, because really with the AIDS crisis, what you have is a lot of stories about the generation that was on the front lines, which is as it should be, because they're the ones who are most impacted. And then there's the generation after mine, which I feel like got like a whole wealth of queer storytelling, because the landscape of representation changed so much in those 2 generations. But there's very few stories about my particular generation, which was the one that was coming of age during the AIDS crisis. And we were the ones who were internalizing all that fear messaging and stigma messaging. And so I kind of just pitched her a very broad story about, like, I want to write about what it felt like to be an immigrant to the US during those years, realizing I was gay as it was getting worse and worse. And she said, go write that book. And so without her, I don't feel like I ever would have written that book. And that's the book that unlocked for me a whole new, much more personal style of storytelling. And after that, almost every single book I have written, all of which were written with her so far, plucked from something in my life that I needed to figure out. So my next one was the Chandler Legacies, which was very much inspired by my time in boarding school and the culture of abuse that was present at that time in boarding school. But also it was, that whole story is about how do you reconcile your feelings toward a place that hurts you and your friends, but also gifts you all the friends you'll have for life and the mentor you needed. And how do you make sense of that juxtaposition? And then came Only This Beautiful Moment, which was obviously, as we've discussed, deeply personal. And then Desert Echoes, which you introduced in the beginning, was very much inspired by the loss of my first boyfriend, who was a magnetic human, who was my first, real relationship and love, but who also suffered from demons of addiction and mental illness. And it's about that feeling of reconciling grief with the joy and the hope that you need to then keep living. So, yes, I think I've been very lucky to have, like you said, did I call it a literary healer? I love that. For anyone who's listening, I think the takeaway from that is you choose, hopefully, if you have that luxury, you choose the people you work with wisely, and the people you let into your life, whether it's friends, teachers. I had a healer as an English teacher in high school. That my high school English teacher, and high school for me is, I think, what you call college. So apologies for confusing anyone, but my English teacher in boarding school was the first person I came out to. So that was something, and I came out to him almost a decade before I came out to my parents. So coming out to him was a very important step in what was a long journey for me. He was also, I came from a conservative cultural community that didn't see the arts as a viable option necessarily for a career. He was the first person to recognize that I could write and to encourage the creative side of me. I really feel like the people we allow into our lives as important figures mean so much, because if if they're people that really have our best interests at heart, they're going to lead us toward our path. If they're not, they're going to cut you down. And I've had some of those in my life as well. So learning to tell the difference of who really wants to support you and who doesn't is important.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that. You touched there on a creative career, and yours has spanned various different elements. So perhaps you could just talk to us a little bit more about that and what it is you do and have done. And then off the back of that, we're interested to know, do you write your books with the thought that they could possibly be films or TV series, or do you think that keep those things very separate? Are you always thinking with a multimedia mindset?
I mean, we can get into this a lot. What was the first part of the question again? Because now I'm caught up on the other one. I have so many thoughts.
So just to refresh, obviously, a lot of people on the call won't be as familiar with your career pathway. So
Right.
just what else have you done apart from writing?
Yes. So I started my career like many people do, which is I moved to Los Angeles and got an assistant job. If you want to work here in Los Angeles, if you want to work in Hollywood, which I did, you move here and you're somebody's assistant. That's just how it begins. I did not realize at the time, I was an English major. I loved books. I loved writing, but I never planned on it being my career at all. The job of being an assistant out here in LA, a lot of it is reading scripts. So for me, I was over 2 years, I was an assistant at 2 different producers. And other than sitting at a desk, and again, I'm older. So for anyone listening, this is pre-internet, pre all of that. You know, my job is like answer phones. You have a little like paper sheet where you write all the phone calls, who called, who's owed a call. And other than that, it was reading scripts because, you know, back before computers could read scripts for people, a human had to read a script and write coverage. So over the course of a week, I would have to basically read everything that was submitted to my bosses, write a synopsis, and then write a recommendation of whether they should read it or not and why. And that was like a boot camp of screenwriting. And so over the course of those 2 years, I started to realize, wow, like every script I'm reading is from a human being who's being paid to write. And I'm here answering phones. Like, why don't I try to do this? This seems like a fun job. And so I didn't know anything about actually writing a script. I had a very good friend who was getting an MFA in playwriting. And I told him I kind of started to understand the film business and did he want to write a screenplay with me? And so that's what we did. We wrote a screenplay. And as everyone in any industry will tell you, relationships are very important. I was very lucky that I had a friend who was an actress who was doing quite well at that point, and she offered to show the script to her manager. Those managers ended up signing us and asked us to write another script so they could start submitting us for jobs. All of this happened. It wasn't some plan I had in my mind. It was just kind of something I fell into. And that led to about 8 years of writing screenplays. At that point, it was feature films. This is a much bigger conversation, but the kinds of feature films we were writing, that business is, I would say, defunct. It doesn't really exist anymore. Hollywood has changed drastically since then. In 2007 and 2008, there was a writer's strike. So I've been through 2 writer's strikes here in Los Angeles. We are very lucky in that most workers, not all, but most are unionized, including writers. But that writer's strike was very much of like a marker in my career in that, you know, we struck for some reasons that were linked to changes in the industry, as we also just ended a strike last year. Also, anytime there's great change, there has to be new contracts. And when I left that strike, the business that I was in of writing feature films was largely done. And so I decided I was going to have kids, and I decided to move toward a more stable career and go to business school. So I actually have an MBA. I don't know if that's what you call it in the UK, but it's a master's in business. I don't do a whole lot with what I learned there about like finance and spreadsheets, but what I did learn there was a really new way of thinking in a more entrepreneurial way. And I think this is very important for anyone out there to hear, especially if you're an artist. A lot of artists, at least for me in my first half of my career, it's a very passive job in that you have to wait for someone else to give you a job. You're like, you can create, but you're always waiting for somebody from a company to validate your creation. And what I learned in business school is to start taking some risks on myself. And so that first novel I wrote was rejected everywhere, and I decided to self-publish it while I was in business school because I was learning a lot about business. It ended up doing quite well and winning a pretty prestigious award. And without that, I would never have started writing my young adult books and built a whole career as an author. And then the other thing I did was I was having a meeting with a company, an independent company that I was going to pitch a movie for me to write for. And I noticed they didn't have a head of development running their company. And so instead, I did pitch myself as a writer, but I also pitched myself as their head of development to run their company. And they ended up hiring me. And so for 6 years, I became, I was on the other side of it, where I was the one working with writers, finding projects for us to invest in. And that's how I became involved with movies like Call Me by Your Name and The Artist's Wife and Little Woods, which is a movie I love, a lot of great movies. So all of that to say, for me, that's the biggest like shift in my career was from a more passive way of thinking to a more active way of saying, I can't wait for others to validate me and tell me it's my time. I have to make it my time until they catch up. And in terms of writing my books for movies, I will be brutally honest with you, which is to say, the whole reason, one of the biggest reasons I wrote my first novel was out of frustration, because the scripts, I had often written very personal scripts in film and TV about Iranian people, about queer people. They never got made. Those are always scripts that get used to get me jobs writing on projects that do get made that have no correlation to my lived experience. Especially when I started to have kids, and when I was in that process, I was looking at the work I had done that actually got made, and I felt like I don't want my kids growing up and feeling like I never told my story. I never did something that meant something real to me, that reflected my values. So I really write my books primarily, I make more money in Hollywood. And I think that's important to point out, because artists often don't talk about the financial part of it. But, the books I write because I feel like I have to write them to give voice to a community that hasn't had that privilege yet. And if anything, what I have learned from the fact that none of them have gotten made as movies or TV is that I made the right decision, because not all of my books, but almost all of my books have been optioned, often by very fancy, powerful Hollywood people. I've had great actors line up to try and, help make stuff. I've had big producers, but when it comes time to try and actually get the funding to make a project that's expensive about queer Iranian people, it just doesn't happen. And so every time we almost get there, but don't get my books made as films or TV shows, it makes me feel prouder that I was smart enough to write them as novels.
That's such a shame they've not been made into films, though. And hopefully that will change.
Yeah, I hope it'll change. But it's also like you have to, someone will my mom will be like, why isn't Only This Beautiful Moment a series yet? And I'm like, you show me the company that's going to fund a series that takes place in Iran and LA in the 1930s, 1970s, and present day. I mean, you're talking about so it's like, I've also been a producer. So you got to think about the money. Like, it's a niche, because in there, I'm not defending it, but I also want to say that I understand it from a business perspective. You're talking about a project that has a limited audience, because there's just a lot of people that aren't going to watch something about the politics of the Middle East, but that has a huge budget, because you need to recreate 3 time periods, a revolution, protests, Hollywood, there's so and again, that I will say, that's another reason, if you're a storyteller out there and think about the medium, I've written in a lot of mediums. One of the reasons I love the medium of novels is you don't have to worry about budget. When you're writing for film or TV, you have to think about this. Everything costs money. Time periods cost money. An extra actor costs money. When you're writing a book, you can be like, now we're in the 1930s on the MGM lot, and there's Joan Crawford, and now we're at a Madonna concert, and I don't have to pay for the music rights. And that was a huge thing with the love story, just music. I mean, music costs so much money. So if you write a book and Madonna is a crucial piece of it, everyone's going to look at it and be like, we can't afford this. I can't pay for the rights to Vogue,
I'm curious to know, how do you watch films, or do you watch films with a producer hat on? Are you able to just relax and enjoy the films? Do you watch your own films that you've worked on?
I never watch my own films, nor do I read my own books. I hate it. The only reason I would ever read my own book again would be if I, like, when we have been in conversations about adapting them into film or TV, I've gone back to reread them to prep the pitch and stuff. I don't enjoy rereading them. My own films, some of the films I've had made, I've never even watched. I don't like looking at my own work. It feels like all I would do is self-criticize and feel like I would want to jump in and change things. And it would stop me from what I hope is like where I am, which is in a state of constantly thinking about the next thing I want to create versus worrying about the last thing I created. I can definitely watch stuff and take my producer hat off. I'm not always. There are times where I feel like, especially if something is very close to something I may do, then I'll be thinking more about the story. But a lot of the stuff I like to watch and read is so outside of the realm of what I do anyway, that it's very easy for me to still be just an audience member and just a fan and watch and enjoy and not think about the story structure or how it was made or anything.
That is a fabulous segue, because I'm poised to ask you on behalf of Book Club about other books that you enjoy. So let's start with books, and then let's maybe bring in films and TV. What are the sort of books you do read for pleasure? What might you recommend?
Wow. I mean, so many. Reading for pleasure, I tend to read, I guess, adult literary fiction more than anything. I love, like, the last book I read that really, really wowed me was a book called The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. I don't know if you guys have heard of that.
Haven't read it yet. It's on the list.
It's Irish. I have a very, very strong connection both to the UK and to Ireland. I love Irish writers. I love Sally Rooney, for example. I have not read Intermezzo yet because I've been too busy, but it is on my shelf. But I read a lot of Irish writers. I read a lot of some things that I read that have wowed me are things I would never do. Like, two of my favorite novels of the last decade were novels in verse. Both are from the UK, actually. Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta, which is a young adult book. Those are both books that, just because I could never even fathom writing in verse, really just wowed me, and in their ability to both write in that poetic way but still tell a story that felt like a novel, felt incredibly powerful to me. I know this is a discussion about Jane Eyre as well, and that you guys are discussing it. I was an English major who really loved a lot of older books. The very interesting thing I've discovered as a now almost 50-year-old is when I go back to read those old books, which I don't often, but I sometimes do, I realize how much my brain has changed and become accustomed to more modern styles of writing. And so there's books that I used to fly through in college that now are much harder for me to read. And I'm like, wow, it's different when you're in that university mindset and you read books like that every week. It's harder. But I did recently read Madame Bovary again, because that was always one of my favorites. And I loved it, but it took me a while to get into the rhythm. So that's something that I want to do more of, I think, as I have more time, is go back to some of those classics that I love. Though there are a few, I don't want to say too much, but for a project I'm working on, I did go back and read a lot of Oscar Wilde. And that remains, I mean, he's such an entertaining writer. You don't need any work to get into his writing. And for anyone, when I was young, like probably from the age of 12 into my teen years, my favorite novel I would have said it's The Picture of Dorian Gray. It was my favorite book. I feel like that book really spoke to me. I love James Baldwin. I don't know if that's an author who's taught in the UK as much as here, but I was exposed to James Baldwin in university, and he remains my favorite writer, particularly a book called Another Country, which I reread probably every few years, almost like a marker of like, how do I respond to it as an older person? I'll stop there, but feel free to ask follow-ups.
We've actually got a question come in anonymously from a school who would like to know what was your favourite book when you were in high school. So that's when you were a teenager. Did you have any books that you connected with?
In high school, definitely The Picture of Dorian Gray, 100%. That was my favorite book until I read James Baldwin. I wasn't, a lot of the books I read that most spoke to me, I started to discover in university when I was an English major. That's when, especially because I start in that um, program that I was in, I took classes in more niche literary subjects. So I wasn't only reading the biggest classics. I took a Beat Generation class where I read Allen Ginsberg and Kerouac and Burroughs and all them, and that was mind blowing. I took an African American lit class where I read Baldwin and Toni Morrison and authors that I hadn't been exposed to yet. But in at the high school level, Oscar Wilde was the one. I really was just obsessed, and it's very interesting because that his sensibility, that kind of like sense of humor that is there in Wilde, is something that I still to this day feel like is such a core part of.
I'm so conscious that we're into the last 5 minutes, which
Oh God.
I know we've got so many more questions as well. So anybody who's sitting on one and wants to slip it in under the wire, I think I'm going to ask one, and then probably Sophie can ask one or two more, but depends how long the answers are as well. So yeah, if you've got a question you desperately want to ask, please do. There we go. I can see one just come in.
Did you guys see that in the time we've been talking, the sun came up?
So I'm going to ask, because this is a nice one. How did you feel? And I'm afraid can't shout the school out because it is anonymous. But how did you feel when you saw your book in a bookshop for the first time?
The best. Honestly, I am still not over that. When I go, my kids are so funny. I can't remember where it was, but there was a bookshop recently we went into and my book was there, and I still got all excited. And they were like, "Why do you still get excited? All the bookstores carry your books now." And I was like, "But you don't understand. It's still exciting." Part of it is because I love bookshops. I genuinely, when I travel, and I travel a lot, travel is very important to me. The first thing I do is compile a list of the bookshops that I'm going to visit so that I can start going. To me, the bookshops are the heart of the places I go, and I want to see them. I have a real relationship with, like in London, I don't know where you guys are. I know you're scattered over the UK probably, but I have my bookshops in London that I always visit. I know all the booksellers at Gaze the Word. They know me. I go in there. I ask for recommendations. So to me, bookshops are just the sacred space, and to know that I'm there on a shelf is genuinely one of the most thrilling things in my life. And I think that's one thing I'll say. I know we're short on time, and it probably is because I talk too much. I was too verbose in my answers, but in my experience as an adult person who's had a relative level of success in different fields, the success that means the most to me is the one that reflects something that was important to me growing up. So it means a lot more to me to see a book of mine in a bookshop than to have my name on a TV show on a network that doesn't mean anything. Even though one might be more financially lucrative, the other one is like in a piece of my soul, So it's always like I spent 5 years in France, and recently my books are published in France. And recently I was on they did a whole segment on one of the biggest radio stations in France, which I remember listening to and my mom listening to. And even though it's not at all one of the most important things that's happened in my career, to me, it meant more because it spoke to a part of my childhood that meant something to me. And that's how I feel about bookshops, is they're just one of the most important things in the world to me. And please, if you can, always buy your books from independent bookshops.
We've got a question here from 2 students who want to be authors. How long does it usually take you to write a book? And I would love to add to that and just ask for any general advice for creating a successful career in this area.
Yeah. For me, my book writing process tends to be very strange. I will say that overall, it probably takes 2 years for me to write a book, but a lot of those 2 years is spent researching or waiting for notes from an editor. I do tend to write the books very fast once they come to me, but it takes me a long time to think. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll think of like a subject matter or a world. I'm happy to keep going, by the way, if we can. So I'll think of a subject matter or a world that interests me, and it takes me a while to research. So like with Like a Love Story, I talked about ACT UP. Like I spent a lot of time re-immersing myself in the history before I took time to write. But the first draft probably only took me a month to write. Then I sent it to an editor who spent a long time thinking about what it needed to be shaped, sent me notes, and then I spent another month doing a second draft, and then you send it back. So overall, I would say 2 years, but a lot of those 2 years are spent either researching, thinking, waiting. It's not all writing for 2 years.
Thank you. And with apologies to anybody who has to shoot off, we are going to make sure to ask this final question from a school before we wrap up. So anybody who does have to go, you'll get the recording as usual, and we will hope to see you next week for the final session before Christmas. But from an anonymous school, what age did you start to show a passion and ability for writing, and who inspired, and let's add supported, I guess, but who inspired you the most?
I showed a passion for writing at a young age because not that recently, during the pandemic, we went to spend about a couple months with my parents, and that gave me time to open up closets I hadn't opened up in a long time. I found old notebooks of mine from when I was like 12 years old, I believe, where I wrote poems. I showed a passion for writing. I did not show an ability. They were so bad. And I say that as someone who has 12-year-olds who write the most beautiful. I mean, our daughter writes lyrics and they're like, I'm like, what in the world? These are like Lana Del Rey level lyrics. But mine were terrible. So passion and ability were different things. At a young age, I was very, very inspired by comic books, especially Archie comics. I don't know if Archie comics are as big a thing in the UK. This is a time when I had been moving to America, and Archie comics to me felt like the peak of Americana. It's like that was the America I wanted to move to. It wasn't the reality of the America I moved to. So I loved comic books. I often drew my own comics. I loved poetry. And I think like many young people, poetry is like the first thing you write. I have since, even as an adult, I've now tried to write poetry and I've discovered it's just not my medium. I can't do it. Like they're not good. Which makes me very sad, but I do love reading poetry and loved it then. And I also was just I loved movies. I loved especially old Hollywood movies. I always felt very out of time in the sense, I still feel that way. And I often write teenagers who feel out of time. Like when I was young, and my editor always points this out. She's like, why are your characters listening to Ella Fitzgerald? And I'm like, because that's who me and my friends listened to in high school. Like I was always listening to music from before my time and watching movies from before my time, in the sense of like longing and nostalgia was in me. And I think a lot of my art is very much in communication with the past often.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have got time for today. But thank you so much, Abdi, for taking the time to speak to our students about such a wide range of things there.
Thank you. I hope some of that was helpful. If it wasn't, please remember that it started at 6 a.m. my time.
I was saying that we know you're taking some time out before a really, really busy day ahead as well. But so thank you so much for joining us. And I think we're just going to wrap up and give the details for next week.
Yeah, thank you, Abdi. What an insightful Q&A, and a huge thanks, everyone, for joining us. A feedback form will be shared with you soon via email, so we'd really appreciate both students and school staff completing this. You could also share your comments before you leave the webpage via the poll we've added to Slido. You'll see it where the Q&A function is. We've got one remaining session of Jane Eyre, and that is with the author of the abridged version, Patrice Lawrence. That's next week. Please head to our National Teen Book Club webpage for more information and to register your groups if you haven't already. You can also find more broadcasts on the Speakers for Schools website, and we'll be sharing other Discover Creative Careers event information in our post-session email, so there's loads to get involved with for that. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed today, and we'll see you soon.